I'm Cain, and this is Sean Wilde, and we're doing an interview today about my book, Initiation into Witchcraft. So we started to do interviews with different Warlock Press authors, and I'm also a Warlock Press author. So I'm Sean's publisher, one of his publishers, and I suppose I'm self-published. You're not self-published, but I'm self-published because I'm my own publisher. It's kind of funny that way, isn't it? So we're going to discuss that, and we're not prepared at all. Sean loves to be controversial, so he's should have got some juicy questions ready for me. But you can also call in at 309-GODDESS if you want to call into the show to ask any questions of us. We've been more than happy to have you. I'd like to see if the phones work. You know, this is our first split screen interview that we've tried, and so it looks really good from what I'm seeing, except I keep looking at the computer, and I shouldn't. I should be looking at the camera. I'm terrible at that. So I'm going to turn it over to Sean. We should be like about an hour of interviewing. So it is about my book, Initiation into Witchcraft. I also have a hard copy, right? And you can get it at hexwitch.com. You can get it at omensalem.com. You can get it at our stores. You can get it at Sean's store, I believe.
Yes.
If you're out of the country right now, I think that for our books, Amazon's probably your best bet. However, we are working on changing that. So they've been working diligently to get us to where we can actually ship to other countries. And if you're looking for wholesale, it's Ingram and New Leaf, I believe, are the two best companies to get them from. We don't directly wholesale ourselves currently. Anyway, gosh, when did I write this book? It's been a while now, hasn't it? Anyway, so I'll turn it over to you, Sean. I'm ready for my interview. I've got my little mimosa here.
Sounds good. Well, Brian already did part of it for me, so here we are with Brian Cain to talk about Initiation into Witchcraft. Brian is a high priest of Alexandrian Witchcraft. He's also the co-owner of Hex and Omen in New Orleans, which are two occult shops in New Orleans, as well as the co-owner of Hex and Omen in Salem. So a co-owner of four very successful occult shops, also a published author. Brian was joking that he's self-published, but he does own a publishing company, so maybe quasi-self-published. It is a publishing company as opposed to just whatever, Lulu or something like that. And he, one of the books of a publishing company, Warlock Press, was Initiation into Witchcraft. So Brian, just for people that may not know, I see we've got a number of viewers here already, so hello everybody and welcome. If you have any questions, I believe you can call in at 309-GODDESS, and then also there's a chat option available if I recall correctly.
Yeah,
but I won't see that Brian will.
I can see the chat, so if you have questions on the chat, we'll go ahead and answer them from there, but we'd love to hear your voices.
So, Brian, can you give just a background on yourself in terms of the occult, Alexandrian witchcraft, in terms of when you were initiated, what degree you hold, and your kind of occult background?
Well, it's a long saga. I started studying witchcraft when I was about 15 years old, seriously, and I suppose the book that I have to attribute to what you see before you is Raymond Buckland's Complete Book of Witchcraft, the Big Blue as we like to call it, which is still the top-selling book on witchcraft pretty much everywhere. And most people don't know that, but even in our company, my book was number 2 for a long time, but I can't beat Uncle Bucky. He still outsells my book in my own company. So it's a very good book for beginners because it introduces you to the entire concept authentically, and I think it's not given a lot of credit. But probably the big change that it introduced to me, like most people, I thought of witchcraft as just being magic at that time. I didn't really know that it had a deeper side to it. I certainly didn't know anything about initiation. But that was the first book that I started to read, and then of course I read everything I could. And at that time there were, there still are, a lot of good books on the subject. However, it wasn't as saturated as it is nowadays. So I think I was really blessed because there was a used bookstore, and for some reason that bookstore had a lot of the books by the founders of the Witchcraft Revival, which were not in print at the time. So, back then I was able to read the books by Gerald Gardner and Doreen Vinte and Patricia Crowther, and of course, What Witches Do. And I still have my What Witches Do copy. It was a used copy I got at that bookstore that is actually, it was first edition, so it's out of print. You can't even get it anymore. I think I have to have it rebound. So I was exposed to good information, and I just kept studying and reading. And in my late teens, I did join a group, and I was first initiated into that witchcraft group, which was not Alexandrian Witchcraft. 3-degree system, just like Alexandrian Witchcraft has, because it was, by today's standards, we would call it Traditional Witchcraft. But back then, they just called it Witchcraft. And really, they're usually cold copies of Alexandrian and Gardnerian Witchcraft anyway, so in my opinion. So that's how I started my journey. Probably the biggest epiphany for me, though, when reading Raymond Buckland's Complete Book of Witchcraft, was that witches actually had gods. They had a goddess, and so I began really looking into goddess worship and looking into the history of the craft, and away we went. So Alexandrian initiation, I kind of think of it as like, going and getting your doctorate or something, I had been running a coven for 25 years at that point in time, but I'd moved to New Orleans, and I had a year where I wasn't in a coven because I was new to the city, and so I wasn't working the craft the way that we work it, and still did magic, but I was alone, and I kept meeting all of these initiates of Gardnerian and Alexandrian witchcraft, people who were a part of a line of succession that I really respected and knew a lot about. I had no intention of getting reinitiated ever. That was, in my mind, it's like, how many times can you knock on a door? It's like, how many, wouldn't you get bored if I just kept knocking on your door asking for the same thing? So I, had this epiphany, though, one day, that it was as if the goddess told me, I've been stringing these initiates along your face for an entire year, haven't you noticed? And I came into, the idea that I wanted to be a part of that history, and started that journey, and here we are today. So, I have been running the New Orleans Coven since 2014, when it was founded here in New Orleans. It's pretty well known now in our small circles of the occult. And I'm helping to open up a coven in Salem. And of course, one of my students has opened a coven here in New Orleans as well, Levi. He's running his own Pontchartrain coven, which is doing very successful. So it's, I don't know, that's how it began.
All right, awesome. And so bearing that in mind, what was the inspiration for this book? Why initiation into witchcraft in general, in terms of writing this, and why now? What was the inspiration?
Well, first of all, I can't believe the name wasn't taken. So that was one of those things. I wanted to contribute to the history of the craft, and I don't think we need a lot of books nowadays. And it certainly isn't my goal to be an author. Like, that's not a goal that I had. So I did this as a priest. I am working on my second book now, and I say my second and last book on witchcraft. I could see myself doing other projects, but the craft has a lot of really good books already, and there's only so much you can say about an initiatory tradition, so it's kind of been rehashed. However, I started noticing that people just really didn't get it, and some of these older books are out of print, or people are not being exposed to them, and they're getting their information from TikTok, they're getting their information from a lot of sources that are really not actually that good. A lot of people who speak about witchcraft or talk about witchcraft, in my opinion, don't have the expertise or the knowledge of the history. And I certainly wasn't trying to outdo any of the elders and the great work they did. I wanted to contribute. So I had two things in mind: to keep holding that up to people, and challenging people's established, ever-changing vocabularies within the magical community, and saying, well, actually, this is what it originally was, and you've changed it like 3 years ago, and you don't even know that, but this is what it originally was, and people still do this, presenting that and holding that beacon up for people who are really seeking. Not so much about correcting other people as it is, we're still here, So I wanted to contribute to that. I also didn't want the book to just be like every other book. So I had to do it in an unusual way. I had to approach it in an unusual way. I certainly, made my points in there. And it's been really well received by my betters in some ways. So happy about that.
Fair. And so you kind of touched on it or alluded to it. Well, who's your target audience for this? Is your target audience somebody who's not initiated, somebody who is initiated within the Alexandrian Tradition, other initiates? Who would be the target audience?
I'd say it's really for non-initiates. Initiates don't need to hear what I have to say. They might like it, but if it's a valuable tool for initiates, or if it's a valuable tool for covens out there, and it certainly does shed some light on certain situations. One of the things I wanted to do in this book that is kind of for the initiates, more so than it is for the general public, because for the general public, some of it's going to go over their head a little bit, is the complexity of lineage within witchcraft, that it's not as simple as just Gardnerian and just Alexandrian. You go onto any Wikipedia kind of thing, and it'll basically say, Alexandrian witchcraft's Gardnerian witchcraft with Kabbalah, and sometimes they wear robes, and it's not entirely accurate, it's just a cut and paste answer that's been regurgitated so many times, sort of like one of the mythologies that were called the Alexandrian Tradition because we were named after the Library of Alexandria. That's just not true, but it's this thing that's gone on and is still going on where people actually say that to people, and they've written about it and they say it was named after Alex Sanders, just like Gardnerian was named after, Gerald Gardner. There are numerous differences, but they both come out of witchcraft. So when Alex was being initiated early on, there wasn't such a thing as Gardnerian and Alexandrian witchcraft yet. So some of these narratives that we have now were not in the mind. So he would have never said he was Gardnerian because no one was saying that, and so it's never entered it into his mind that he was Gardnerian. It wasn't till later, almost, I think I'm not the best with dates, but I think it was in the late 60s that the Alexandrian actually got taken on because people had started coining Gardnerian. And then from what I understand, some people were already calling us Alexandrians. And so they finally just went with it, and it became a thing. But really, the truth of the matter is that Gardnerians and Alexandrians are all witches of the book, as I would say. So we all follow the Book of Shadows, which is a funny thing that came up again recently, and I always just want to, get on my soapbox and inform people. So from our perspective, there is a holy book akin to our Bible that we call the Book of Shadows. That's the name of this grimoire. And so when outsiders are saying Book of Shadows, and they've rewritten the narrative to where now that's everyone's personal book, and it's been written about so many times, it's an established idea that is also not true. It's no different than if I said, well, look, I've written my own Key of Solomon. The Book of Shadows was the name of the grimoire that has been used by witchcraft priesthood since its inception, and it's still being used today. So we all follow that book. We may interpret it differently, but we follow that book. And we do the rituals in that book, so that's the commonality. And it is the same book. There's variations between the lineages. But that was the other thing, is to pointing out to people, there's not one Alexandrian. There's several lineages that have gone on, just like there's several Gardnerian lineages. And they don't all agree or interpret things in the same way. And the Book of Shadows, of course, has some variations in it because it was hand-copied and it was descended in different lines. So people who've studied various versions can actually tell who it comes from sometimes by the contents.
That's pretty cool. So there is, although it's kind of universal within the tradition, there's also slight variations then as well.
Yeah, of course, because you've got people who made mistakes when they were copying, and then that mistake gets copied, and it goes on and goes forth. So we are all taught now. I don't know if it was as serious early on, but we're taught now to copy it exactly the way it is, mistakes and all, because it's also a historic book. So even the mistakes are preserved, which is difficult for people who have really good grammar.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that. So this is one of the things, everybody who's watching. Some of these questions I already know the answers to. Brian didn't know any of the questions I'm going to be asking today, or that I've already asked. And some of them I already know the answers to, but some of the information I'm getting is new as well. So that's what I think what's cool about things like this is that I'm actually learning something new as well, even though Brian and I chat, we're friends. So it's pretty cool for me as well. So you talked about target audience. You actually touched on this a little bit. And I was going to ask you later on, but since you've touched on it, in your book, you talk about power of lineage. And can you kind of explain what you mean by that and what that means in general, what that means to you in the context in the book?
Well, in witchcraft, and I think this is true of other magical traditions as well, we hold the ancestry of our initiation. It's lineaged. So I know who initiated who going back to Alexander's, and my people know theirs as well. So it's like there's a chain. So Alex initiated, Maxine or whoever, and it goes on and on and on, right? So that's part of it, and I think people really like that, but there's a spiritual implication too, to where we believe genuine power is also passed through that. And so you actually are magically connected to your priestly ancestors, whether they're living or dead, and that power has been passed down, and it's a practice that's been going on, we think, since the dawn of man in some way, shape, or form. Other magical traditions have this as well, or people might venerate their physical ancestors in the same kind of idea. But for us, because witchcraft is not an ethnic religion, we believe in reincarnation. And so the initiation is more about the souls who've chosen that path and who've passed it on. And it's one of the reasons why I believe in the legitimacy of Alexandrians and Gardnerians, is because it's still going on. In the 90s, I think there were hundreds and hundreds of traditions about witchcraft, and you can go find them today, and if you really dig, you'll find they're all practically extinct. Half these traditions that people used to talk about, they don't really exist anymore. People who were involved in them exist, but they don't seem to carry on that living, breathing thing, whereas Gardnerians and Alexandrians are still all over the world, and it's thriving.
So there's something that you talked about there that I think is important to touch on, where you talk about the power of that lineage, that almost unbroken chain, if you will, and that of course relates then to the power of initiation. What are your thoughts on initiation versus not, in terms of people calling themselves witches or people practicing witchcraft, and how would you differentiate between those two, other than the obvious, which is one's initiated and one isn't? We kind of just touched on that a little bit, but how else would you differentiate it?
Well, that's a conversation that's racy and complicated, because in one sense we were taught early on that you had to be initiated to be a witch, But in truth, when we're initiated, we are given the title of witch and priest, or witch and priestess. So no one's initiated as a Wiccan. No one's initiated Wicca. It's witch and priest, or witch and priestess. So I think by the virtue of that idea there, we're saying not all witches are priesthood. There's a reason why there's two titles given, right? So I don't ever knock an initiate who feels like you're not a witch if you're not an initiate. That's up to their personal standard, and usually they're going to be very private about that opinion, because it's an opinion that's triggered and offends lots of people. But for me personally, I think that the religion of witchcraft has thrived both in and outside of initiatory circles, but I do think there's a distinction between how we do things and how some other people might do things, but they don't quite realize that they're influenced, So if you study the history of the craft and you look at one of the newest authors today who has no connection to it, I could still dissect that and say, well, this came from us, this is being used wrong, but it comes from us too. So the food chain of the whole thing, like everyone who practices witchcraft today, something in their practice comes from Gerald Gardner. Something does, and so that's just the way that it is. Now, where I do draw the line is if you don't believe in the goddess, I don't consider you a witch. And I don't consider magic to make someone a witch either. Even in the English language, we've got two different words for this for a reason. And historically speaking, it wasn't used as magic. And it wasn't used in magic in the culture that the word comes from. Because what we have to realize is, witch is an English word. That's where it comes from, merry old England. It doesn't exist anywhere else. People's ideas about witchcraft, that's, been spread. And I think people forget that it's being spread in the English language. You know, when I meet witches in Portugal or places like that, you know, we've had the conversations about why the Book of Shadows cannot be translated into another language, because it's not allowed. It has to be copied in English, you know, and that is the way, you know. And I tried to play the devil's advocate, and I was like, well, why couldn't we translate it into Portuguese? And this Portuguese man said to me, it wouldn't mean the same thing. It doesn't translate. It just doesn't. Not languages aren't as universal. We, being, you know, Americans or the British, you know, we have an English privilege. We seem to think that our words are actually grafted onto everything. So you'll hear arguments like, well, cooking is the same thing in every language. Everyone has a word for cook. It doesn't necessarily mean the same thing, though. Like, it can have a million different nuances. So the word witch, we know where it comes from. It comes from English language. And in Middle English, it was witch. And in Old English, it was witcha or witchy, which is where people get the word Wicca from today, because they're just mispronouncing Old English, you know. But like the other ideas we've talked about, it's become cosmopolitan, and people don't like to change, even when presented with facts. You know, you'll still have the people who will be like, witchcraft and Wicca are two different things. I'm like, it's literally from the same language. It's the same word. And it was really pronounced witcha or witchy, you know, in our version. Of course, they had their accents, you know, and it probably varied depending on where you were from. But it's a Germanic language, but it's not German. It's English. It's its own thing that developed in merry old England. And now is the most dominant language on earth, or at least one of them. And a lot of these ideas about witchcraft and what have you, we have to realize they were spread by white, Christian, English people. You know, and they went around saying, well, that guy's a witch doctor, and this is witchcraft. And so they had the prejudice of being Christian, so therefore witchcraft was always bad, negative, or superstitious, you know, in some way. And it just influenced, you know, and it's only in recent days that you actually find anthropologists moving away from that being a universal word. Current anthropologists won't use the word witch unless they're actually talking about historical witchcraft, you know, like the witch trials or something like that. Otherwise, they'll say pre-Christian people, or they'll, you know, say magical practices, because they're aware now that that's not an accurate way to use the word. It is only within the magical community that you will see outdated concepts that were developed in the 1930s by Christian men being an actual dominating factor within people who are supposed to be magical people. I don't get it personally. Like, I don't say Wicca because I know that's not how it's pronounced. I have to use the word because people understand what I'm saying. But I always correct it with the nuances. That's a modern made-up word. If you're saying it that way, it is something, it's coming out of the word witch still, but you've just invented a modern slang, a different modern slang for witch. It doesn't have a different meaning. It doesn't come from a different culture. It doesn't even come from a different language. You know, it's like the word cat evolved. You know, we could go back and find the Old English word for a cat, and it's going to be a little different, but it's technically the same word because it's from the same language group, if that makes any sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you've touched on this a couple of times already, and again, cheers, by the way. So a lot of people, when they think of witchcraft, I think they think magic. And even the ones that think religion, it feels very almost cloudy or nebulous as to what that means. And you know, just in this interview alone, you've touched on priesthood at least twice. You and I have had multiple conversations about it. Can you kind of talk a little bit more about what it means to you in terms of priesthood and the priesthood of witchcraft, which we don't, in my opinion, really hear enough about? We hear just about the magic of witchcraft. We don't hear about the priesthood of witchcraft.
Well, I think the most interesting, I mean, we're blessed that we live in a place like New Orleans where there's tons of magical people. And of course, now I have home in Salem, which also has tons of different magical people, you know. Salem has every Eurocentric tradition of magic you could possibly imagine floating around there somewhere. And here in New Orleans, we've got other magical traditions that exist that we're exposed to. I think people are ignorant of the subject of the religion of witchcraft. So ignorant that people will tell you to your face, that's not a religion, you know, and it's like, okay, so how do you even begin a conversation that starts that way? You know, would you walk up to a Jewish person and say, I know you consider Judaism to be a religion, but it's not really a religion, you know, so I think they're ignorant of the history of it. So if it wasn't for Gerald Gardner and the people that came after him, we wouldn't be having this conversation about witchcraft. Witchcraft probably would be just in the realms of fairy tales and magic. But we had these people who came forward, and they didn't come forward and just say, well, I practice magic. They said, witchcraft's actually a religion, and we worship a god and a goddess. And this is what we do, and some people like to term that as Wicca now, as we were just discussing. However, the word witch and the word Wicca are both used correctly and incorrectly at such nauseum. It's not even, that's just somebody's own comfortable parameter for themselves. It's not based in fact. So I think the most interesting thing about modern witchcraft isn't magic. I believe in magic. I practice magic. It is a part of my religious belief system. However, I don't think that's the most interesting thing about it at all. I think it's the fact that we are the only priesthood in Western civilization that has existed for thousands of years that worships a goddess. We are a priesthood of the goddess, and that is something that has never existed for a long time. And we've brought back the priestess, a role that has been extinct in Western civilization for a very long time. We were the first people to bring it forward, we're still doing it today, and we're still the only people doing it today, in that sense, right? So we've inspired the goddess movements, we've inspired modern neo-paganism, we've inspired a lot of people. But as far as what are we actually bringing to the table ourselves, I think it's that priest and priestess of the goddess. I think that's the most interesting thing about it, and I think in the long run, that's what the history books will say about us.
Okay, awesome. Just checking the chat right now. Apparently we have a bad echo from me. Guys, has that been cleared up? Are we good now? Somebody wants to chime in the chat. We're about halfway through, so I'd love to not have an echo for the second half.
I don't know if that's maybe not just them, because I don't hear an echo from you.
Yeah, same. I don't either.
Sometimes they could be their connection or something going on with their world, but I don't know for sure.
Well, nobody's saying anything, so we will continue on then. But again, still a bad echo apparently from TJ Jordan.
Oh, apparently there is a bad echo. I don't know why that is.
Yeah, we don't know, guys. We're separated. Is there maybe a sound? Like, can you hear me anywhere other than the headphones, Brian?
I do not. Say something again.
Test.
No, you're just coming through my headphones. So maybe it's. Do you have an open mic or something? Is the echo coming from me or him?
It says, please try turning down the volume. But which volume are we turning down?
Kevin's coming.
Well, I'm sorry, everybody. We'll try and figure it out. It's our first
I don't
time
know
with
what's
the
going
remote
on. I don't hear anything, so that's why I didn't notice. Well, anyway, I don't know how bad it was, guys. Sorry, we had no idea.
Sorry, everybody. Well, I saw it. I tried to address it, but I don't know why. Perhaps, but I've done this before at WitchCon with the exact same speaker and setup, so I didn't have an echo then. So there's got to be somehow how we're interconnecting with each other.
Is it me and him?
Oh,
well, they said it's just you. That's what they're saying. I don't know. So it's got to be something there. They suggested try turning your computer volume down, perhaps.
Let's try that.
I don't know.
Oh, you know what? Because you're coming through my speaker, I wonder if you're also coming through on my mic. There we go.
Might be doing both, yeah.
How's that, everybody? Is that a little better? It just went from 100 to 68. Test.
No one's saying anything, so it must be all right.
Brian's voice is not that great. Well, we know that. Well, so what it sounds like, I don't want to delay anymore, so I apologize if I'm still going to be echoey. But what we will do is, Brian, it sounds like maybe we should test this more with your team and me offline, so we can make sure it doesn't echo again for you guys. Yeah, it's still the same. So it's got nothing to do with my volume then. So I'm going to turn it up because I had trouble hearing Brian at 68. All right. Well, sorry, everybody. We'll figure it out for next time. Okay, so we've talked about the power of the lineage, and we've talked about your audience and kind of differences between being an initiate and a non-initiate. In your book, you talk about if someone's seeking initiation and what they should do. Maybe talk a little bit about the two things that stood out for me were how to know when you're ready, and then also things to work on if you're looking at being initiated. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. You touch on it in your book.
Well, the first thing I would tell people is that I don't think anyone needs to be initiated. I think that's highly misunderstood. I think that's a choice that some of us make, and it is a choice, and it's a life-altering choice. I also think that you need to realize it's a priesthood, so you should approach it with full sincerity and full dedication, as if you were going to become a Catholic priest or something like that, or a rabbi. It is just as serious with just as much work. You have to learn rituals, you have to copy your own Bible by hand, you have to believe in what we're doing and serve at that altar, in my opinion. It's definitely not something for collectors. It's not something that's for a hobby. And for people like that, it's not going to work out anyway, So I think you're ready for it when you can't stand not having it, when you're drawn towards it and you don't have a choice and you're obsessed with it, and I think any good priest or priestess of any walk should be that serious, in my opinion. The reasons why someone's drawn to it, I think sometimes it starts as magic and becomes religious, and sometimes it starts as religious and becomes magic. For me, it was about the beauty of the craft, and I was just drawn to it. I don't think I really had a choice, and there's definitely a reincarnation factor to where there's, not to sound too highfalutin about myself, but there's absolutely been things in craft I knew that I shouldn't have known. And I just knew them. Like, I've done it before. Like, I actually believe I've been a modern initiate before, because there are certain things that just are overly familiar to me. And I think that happens quite a lot. So I think that, once you're on the path of initiation, I think you return to it in your other lives until it's time for you to move on. As far as like what you can do, there's two sides. You can go to the gods and ask them for their guidance. If you're wanting to serve them, that's who I would go to first. Say, can you lead me to the right people if this is the thing for me? And then the intellectual side is really do your research. I'm still shocked today by people who get brought in by people who don't have the full story. And they should be able to tell you who they come from, where they come from. They should be in good standing with them, and they should definitely be able to train you. And if they cannot do those things, then I wouldn't waste my time. It's way too much of an investment. You don't want to spend years only to find out you got a shady end of a deal, so it's not worth it. So make sure you really find out that they're legitimate, that they actually have the lineage, that they actually have the training, and they're going to give those things to you, particularly the training. I think lineage without training is useless. I don't think it's going to do anything for you, because what are you actually carrying on? It's not just the magical side you're carrying on. You're carrying on a culture and a belief system, and you're responsible for it because it doesn't belong to any of us. It was a gift that was given to us that doesn't belong to any of us. And so therefore you have a responsibility, if you have integrity, to carry it on as given, right? And people are coming to you, that's what they're asking for. They're not asking for your stuff. They're asking for the thing that was given to you that they would like to be given to them. And so I think we have a responsibility to pass it on, to the fullest as best we can. And there are lots of priesthood who do a very good job at that, and then there are some that aren't, So it is, but the magic finds a way.
I really like how you said that there's a responsibility, because I think that's a differentiation from other paths of witchcraft, especially non-initiatory ones, where there is a responsibility of the initiate to do that. So I think it's great that you're making that known in terms of how you practice Alexandrian witchcraft. And there is this responsibility. It's not just you're not just here for the magic or just for the religion for your own benefit. It's also a responsibility to carry it on.
Yes, particularly. If you're going to go that far, we do have, degrees. So in Alexandrian witchcraft, we've got the first degree, which makes you a priest or priestess, and then for those people who want to teach and serve, there is the second and third rites, which we do together usually. So that's the two sides of the coin. You're either a teacher or you're not. So certainly if you take the path of saying you want to be a teacher, I think you have an obligation to do that. Some Alexandrian witches are perfectly happy being a first degree, and they're not trying to put themselves up to be a teacher. They're there for their own reasons, and perhaps because they're greedy for power.
Fair. Right. So we touched on it, and of course I've heard other people that are Alexandrian speak on it. Why don't you touch a little bit on power and what that means to an Alexandrian, and how it might be different from other traditions or other individual practitioners?
Well, one of the things that I've cultivated is one of the big differences is philosophical between Gardnerians and Alexandrians. And of course, I'm not one noting that, so I'm not saying all Gardnerians and not all Alexandrians. But one of the things in the history is the fact that we uphold in our philosophies beauty, power, and freedom. And the thing I would say to people is that we are one of those traditions that are completely honest about it. Nobody goes into magical worlds who isn't already on a journey of ego, because you're looking at a situation where this person is saying, I want to control the universe. I can use my will to change the world, to change my world, to change the outcome of events through my sheer will and power. So Alexandrians just meet that right at the front door. We are greedy for power. If it doesn't work, it's pointless, so we don't like empty ritual, and if there's no power, it doesn't interest us. So I think other traditions try to be all humble and stuff like that, and they're sort of like, oh yes, I'm very humble, I don't want power. I'm like, then what are you doing in witchcraft? Obviously you do. So meeting that on head on and realizing that power in of itself is not good or bad. So there's nothing to be ashamed of by saying, I want power. It's all about how you wield it, right?
Yes. So not really related. Actually, I'll do something related because I've got my list of my point form questions on my other screen here, so I'm looking over to the right. I'll talk something related to power, then I'm going to go back for some other stuff I wanted to ask you. So what kinds of magic, and obviously only things you're allowed to say, what kinds of magic might an Alexandrian witch practice? Like what would be some of the forms of magic? As an example, in your book you talk about planetary magic, and you show some seals in there. You talk about hermetic principles and things like that. So what type of magic might an Alexandrian witch be practicing?
Well, the first thing I think that's very misunderstood by the general population is that witchcraft has its own magical system. And of course that is initiatory, and it's not something we teach. It's not for public consumption, right? Nor would it be understood if I flayed it all out, to be honest with you. However, that system of magic is first and foremost we call craft, right? And that's our major way of working magic. However, we are occultists in Alexandrian craft, and so we do explore other magical systems such as the grimoires, angelics, planetary magic, things like that. So we do explore, and I think we explore it because we are greedy for power. We're afraid we're going to miss out on something, So we've got to try things out. But in the very end of the day, it's craft, that is how we work our magic. And we, like I said, it has an internal system. And so it amuses us, and I'm going to sound like a snob here, when people do compare it to just being magic, and we're like, oh, what kind of magic? Because it's, it's a craft, man. Well, what's the craft? Like, what are you talking about? Because they don't know. And we're definitely a lot more than sprinkling herbs and oils on candles, so there's a lot more that goes into it. We're not saying we don't ever use candles, because we do. One of my favorite witches once told me, Brian, I only do candle magic when I don't really care about something. Yeah.
Okay. Oh my goodness gracious. Fair. So there's the craft, which is initiatory and of course then secret. And then there's other forms of magic that Alexandrian witches that you might use, but it's not necessarily inherent in the
not required. Just to quote Maxine, one of the things that is said a lot is Alexandrians do Kabbalah. And, we have strong leanings towards Kabbalah, but it's not required, and it's not witchcraft. It's a very common occult conversation that a lot of occult systems, first and foremost, outside of the craft, everything's planetary magic, in Europe, European style. So because if you look at angelics, or you look at all these other systems or Kabbalah, it always inevitably goes back to planetary magic, in some way. And so that's a very classical system that survived, and it's taken on different forms. So some people want to interpret it through the planets. Some people want to interpret it through the Kabbalah. Some people will interpret through angels, like the Magus, if you're familiar with that grimoire. Its planetary magic is all angels. However, it's still planetary magic. Michael is the day of the sun. So it's the same system. So that's a very old system that has survived in the hands of Christians. Really, but here we are today, and we just I don't know. People do it for different reasons. I suppose when you're younger and you're working magic, it's to see if it works, and because you want something to happen. To me, magic is a tool. Like your book, Magic Without Tools. It's a tool that all human beings have access to, but certain traditions and certain people have found ways to harness it, and that it is new to the world, again, to have groups of people who are propagating the arts, and so not all Alexandrians are occultists, but most of them are, and I think part of that started with the fact that Alex also fancied himself a magician. So he didn't consider himself just a witch. He considered himself a witch and a magician, which goes to show you right there, we consider those things very different. Not bad, but very different. Because a magician, from our perspective, or the more classical terms used within the 1950s, is someone who is just magic. It doesn't necessarily have to be a religion. Can be. They can have a religion, but they're really just focused on wielding magic. That's what a magician does. They could be Christian, they could be Jewish, they could be, whatever. I suppose there's the interpretation that witches are pagan magicians. That's sort of the idea there. But I think that's a limited nuance, because there's a huge difference. I don't consider myself pagan. People don't quite understand what some of us say when we say that, because there absolutely are Alexandrians who call themselves pagan. But it's not part of our actual. It's not in the book. The word pagan does not appear in the book. It doesn't appear in our rituals. It just doesn't exist. And I'm not trying to reconstruct a pre-Christian peoples. And I don't consider witchcraft an ethnic faith. If it was, it would be British, but I don't consider it an ethnic faith, right? So for me, it's sort of the whole nuance of trying to be pagan nowadays is either because somebody's trying to reconstruct something, like they're trying to be a Viking, somehow they always end up on a motorcycle, and then there's, people trying to reconstruct these different, being Celtic or whatever it is. I love a lot of pre-Christian peoples, but contrary to popular belief, I'm not actually trying to be Egyptian. That's a culture that I greatly admire, ancient Egypt. And there are a lot of other cultures I greatly admire, and we do explore them and study them and realize that because they're our ancestors, right? And they were our ancestors who were practicing magic, in an open way. And this is the first time that's happened in a long time. Magic is a pretty socially accepted thing in the scheme of things nowadays, to where we have religions and priesthoods that are pretty accepted in the United States and other places who are cultivating this again.
So you I was just reading chat, got distracted there for a second. So we've talked about magic now a lot, and you kind of touched on other cultures, and throughout this interview, you've talked about the goddess, singular. And in your book, you talk about gods and goddesses. However, there's implications that there's potentially a god and a goddess only for witchcraft. And I was wondering if you kind of could shed some light on that in terms of how you interpret all the various gods and goddesses that we hear about in existence. Are they individual beings? Do you see them as facets of something greater? And if so, what that is? And what, if you're allowed to say, of course, what goddess or god you gravitate towards? In terms of who or what that is.
Well, in the priesthood of witchcraft, Gardnerian, Alexandrian, and a lot of the offshoots that have come out of that, we definitely have a god and a goddess. I don't want to say, I love to tell people that I'm a monotheist because it confuses them so much. And one of the things that I like to do is to get people to think. You know, we were on a talk thing, I think it was for a WitchCon, and there was a woman who was informing me that since we were both polytheists and all this sort of stuff and trying to have this conversation and be all intellectual, and I looked at her and I said, I'm a monotheist. And she was shocked, and it just ended the whole conversation because she didn't really know what she was talking about, and she was trying to approach me and tell me what I believed. So it's very important to me that people realize that, and of course there's going to be personal nuances, but I worship the goddess, and what I mean by that is I mean the goddess. And I think that's extremely important for lots of reasons. The craft is increasingly becoming misogynistic, or things that people would like to call the craft. They've either cut the goddess out entirely and replaced her with the devil. That's a trend that's sort of dying again, thankfully, but it was happening for a while. Like, all your bad, witches who like their roadkill, I worship the devil in the woods, that sort of a thing. And it's something they're making up or they're coming up with on their own accord, which is fine, but it has nothing to do with what I'm doing, And the other thing is, in embracing all these different cultures and LARPing, in a way, I think, they like to replace the goddess with a bunch of little goddesses, And our society right now is very misogynistic and probably always will be. You can have a god, you can have a great god. You can be Jewish, you could be Muslim, you could be Christian, and you can have a great god, and no one is going to challenge that, whether they believe in this god or not. But to say to someone, I believe in the goddess, they're like, what do you mean by that? You know exactly what I mean by that. I just said it. I worship the goddess, which implies that there's one, right? Doesn't mean I expect everyone else to believe it. It's not like a Jesus phenomenon. We're not a salvation religion. We're not trying to convert people to the goddess, but that's what I worship. So as far as what you were asking, I see her in all goddesses. So Kuan Yin, my goddess is Kuan Yin. My goddess is Isis. My goddess is all goddesses. And the way we look at it is facets, just like you are, Shannon's husband and your children's father and somebody's boss, my friend. You're the same entity, but you're different things to different people. And so we look at them as faces of the goddess, manifestations of her, And it's very easy for me to find my goddess in any goddess. I do have a bit of difficulty with the god because we don't talk about the god very much, but it is a balanced system. We just don't talk that much about the god because the world doesn't really need to hear about it. It's not that he's less important to us. Quite frankly, I think the goddess loves everyone. I think Dad only loves us. And I have a hard time seeing him in some gods because gods have become toxic in certain cultures. So it's hard for me to see him, but he's there. It's the same thing, really, right? So it's just how we personally interpret it. Of course, you're going to have your own emotional connections, and when exploring the world of magic, sometimes you get caught up in the magic, and in that moment, Brigid is Brigid, because you're connecting to that egregore of that energy. But do I think they're like action figures and they're all these separate things? No, I don't. I think God is God. And to quote Dion Fortune, there is one God, and all gods are one god, and there's one goddess, all goddesses are one goddess, and there's the great initiator, meaning the unknowable, right? So I'd say the real craft is more like Neoplatonist. It's this idea that there is a source, and then there is a way we interpret the source. And because witchcraft at its very heart is a fertility cult, I know people don't like that word, but it's actually the truth. We're a fertility cult. There is a lot that goes into the flesh in witchcraft. We don't see the flesh as being devoid of spirit. So to put it in Kabbalistic terms, Kether and Malkuth are the same, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
It makes sense to me. Some people might need to look it up. We'll see, but I like that. We'll have an offline conversation about that for sure. I actually really like that. So I'm just looking at my other notes here, and we've touched on the gods and goddesses, and I just thought of something when you were talking about that, especially with how the flesh spirit are not separated, and then I lost it. Let me look at what else I got here. Fertility cult. Yes, fertility cult. Flesh and spirit. So obviously, there's been some controversy about that. In 2023. Well, maybe before that, but publicly in 2023. And you're saying you don't like the word that Alexandrian witchcraft is. Can you talk a little bit about what does fertility mean? I mean, it's 2023. Why do we need fertility? What does that mean for us now? As urban dwellers, how does fertility matter in a modern society, other than the obvious of children?
Well, I think if the crops fail, everyone will get why fertility is important. Because we are all still existing off farms, no matter where we live. The food still has to be grown. And even though the face of that has changed, we rely on fertility in all its forms: animals, plants, humans. We're existing with it as a necessity every day of our life. Without fertility, there is no life. On this planet, there is a biological structure that has been in place for a very long time that continues to propagate more life, and that is fertility. So fertility is life. In magic, fertility is extremely important because, as I said, we don't separate the flesh. Fertility of the flesh is fertility of the spirit, and magic without fertility wouldn't work. Nothing works without fertility. So I would say it's the potency of life, if that makes any sense. Obviously, because we do worship a goddess, and we do have a god and goddess who are heteronormative. It's not that we actually think they're necessarily heterosexual, but they are, lovers, right? Symbolically and in reality. And we all have that relationship. We all, it doesn't matter whether you knew them or didn't know them, we all had a biological mother and biological father. There's not a human being that exists that doesn't have that relationship and that symbol of how life is created within our species. But we can look at other species and it's generally the same pattern in some way, shape, or form. So we revere the mother, right? Which is something that our culture doesn't really revere. We revere her and all her glory. And I think that that's another thing that gets, unfortunately, where I get very angry about the misogyny in our world right now, because there are a lot of things that are put out that seem on the surface positive or enlightened. And if you scratch under the surface, you'll always find this misogyny just looming there, because it's always men, quite frankly, and somehow it's always men who are trying to supersede that divine feminine. I think it's just been so ingrained in our culture for so long. People have a problem with it. It's like you get in a conversation with witchcraft in any of these groups where those guys are, and somebody's going to have to, talk about how the male witch is suppressed and, men can be witches too. And, and they're equal and they gotta, you don't need to say it. We already know we're equal. We're the dominating species on this planet, men, right? So there's no person on the planet besides maybe children who are more, persecuted than women. It's not a religion, it's not a race, it's actually women, like throughout this planet. There's nobody who has less power. There are many places in this world where women have no power and their husbands can just kill them and it's completely legal. That's the overarching reality that the world is living in right now. So we're delusional in Western civilization. We think all of our little things matter to everybody. Most people just want clean water. But we all have a mother and a father, whether we liked them or not. And so, yes, we look at God as being our spiritual mother and father. And fertility is everything. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, he did. To our viewers, wherever the echo, we apologize. It looks like I needed a headset. We didn't know this beforehand. We're the guinea pigs for this setup, so we'll know for next time.
Hopefully we look good. That's what I care about.
We'll make sure that we'll have a headset next time, and I apologize, everybody. But I appreciate you to bear with us for a few more minutes, and then for this interview at least.
We might have to redo some of these interviews at some point in the future. I want to give everyone a chance to call in, though, because we are running out of time. So if you do want to call in, it is 309-GODDESS.
And if you have questions, you can also put it in the comments as well. Brian, while we're waiting for that, and we do only have a few minutes left, so we can touch on this perhaps, and then if we have questions or call-ins, we'll just deal with that. But what would you say would be the largest, and if there even is this one, what's the largest challenge to the craft today?
I think it's the same one it's always been: ego. I think it's always going to be. Once again, every human being that enters into a magical world wants to control the universe. So you're inviting people with egos, and we all have egos, and it's usually our best friend and our worst enemy. So I'd say that's probably the biggest thing. But I also think it's misinformation, and that's probably always going to be a thing too, because people, a lot of people who are attracted to the label witchcraft, they just want to be magical, and they don't want to be told what to do, and they're not looking for a religion, and they just like the label, and we're into our self-chosen labels nowadays. That's very popular in lots of different circles, so I think sometimes you have to sit back and say, it's not about fighting about what a witch is, but realizing that somebody else is using it in a way you're not, and you're not having the same conversation, and that's okay. Like, what witchcraft is to me and what witchcraft is to my world is going to be different than somebody else. And they want to be like, we're the same. And I'm like, no, we're not. We're just not the same. What do we have in common? Magic, okay? But we don't work it the same way either. So I think it's that sort of idea that we always want to be like Borg-like, I think, and everything has to be like under this umbrella of something. Like, that's why they want to put everyone under the pagan umbrella. Like, we're all pagans. And when you say, well, actually, I'm not a pagan, it just really freaks people out, or I'm not a hard polytheist, it freaks people out because it doesn't fit into their narrative. It doesn't freak me out that there's pagans and that they're having festivals and they're doing all these things. I just don't want to go. It doesn't freak me out. Yeah.
Brian, we do have a question from looks like this was Wicked Witch 80. How do you see witchcraft in 10 or 20 years from now? What do you see as the future of witchcraft?
Well, I think that the true craft is just going to carry on like it always has, and it is something that people don't realize. It's a secret society, and that secret society has been, depending on what narrative you're going at, working towards 100 years as being known, by society. It could have continued or been there before. That doesn't really matter though, does it? So I think it'll just carry on. I think the fads will carry on as well and change. It happens every 5 years where, just a few years ago, like, everyone was like crazy about the devil, and then it was like just cursing and killing people, and roadkill was a big thing for a while, and I've seen the rebirth, and death of Scott Cunningham Wicca. I've seen the narratives change over and over and over and over and over again. What you can say, what you can't say, what you can believe, what you can't believe, what's the current label. I've seen the common regurgitated misinformation being passed along like facts to by people who aren't actually involved, but the craft that exists in people's homes and in covens throughout the world and in a subculture, that's just going to carry on like it always has, and it's going to be its own thing, and it's private and no one else is involved. If you're not initiated, you're not involved in that, and you don't know what happens at my coven meetings. You don't know what's going on. Who knows who's going on? People who are in my coven, or people who have been in my coven, or people who've visited my coven from other covens, and vice versa, and that's how I know what they do. I know what the Oswestry coven did because I've gone to it and I've worshipped with them, and we're following the same book, so there's like commonalities, but it's not. If you're not doing that, it's not even the same relevant conversation. And this book was just about saying, hey, guess what? This is actually a thing. It's happening. It's happening right now. Right now, someone is being initiated into witchcraft, probably several people. And they are being given access to information that is not in the hands of the general public. Even though we have FOMO and we want to think we've figured it all out, trust me, you haven't.
So on that note of holding up your book, and because I have the echo, I'll have you do it, Brian. Can you let people know how to find you and also how to find your book?
Well, the best place to contact me probably is Facebook, which I think is true of all of us these days, right? So as I said before, you can find my book at hexwitch.com, which is our website, or omensalem.com, which is our website. I believe Sassy Magic carries them, and I believe they probably have a website too. There are a lot of occult stores that carry them. I'm not going to know. Like, you hear about it from time to time, but it's always cool when you find them in a more local kind of place. Heck, I mean, yours probably is too. Mine was on the Barnes & Noble website. I don't know if it actually ever made it into the store. I have no idea, but they were selling it on their website. So it just gets put out everywhere. I think most people buy it directly through us or Amazon probably. And then if you want it wholesale, I always get confused. This Christian will kill me. It's New Leaf and Ingram. I can't remember which one's the main one right now. But those are the wholesale companies that you can get the book from. So that's all good news. And I haven't actually made this announcement, but we are inviting all of the Warlock Press authors to a trade show next summer. I just haven't got a chance to tell you about that yet. So we're not going to make you go, but we will pay for it. Warlock Press is definitely a company that's slowly growing. It's a very indie. It's a small branch of our bigger thing. You know, like most things, we ran into it like Captain Kirk. You know, no actual plan. Just put me in that astro belt and give me more power. You know. But we've got some new books coming out. So Levi's actually coming out with his new book. That's in the works, like the cover and all that's already kind of put in place. I'm working on another book at the moment. And we are publishing a book, I'm not sure if it's those, but by Fiona Horn. So that's, so we're slowly growing, and we're very picky about who we choose to work with and the subject matters, because the one thing I really wanted to do to make us different is really try to stand behind the authenticity of the authors and the subjects that they're writing about. You know, it'd be really easy to churn out a bunch of books on witchcraft written by a bunch of eager beavers, you know, but we don't want to do that. We want books by initiates or practitioners of their specialties. And that's what we want to put out, you know, or their passions. Some subjects are more liberal than others, I suppose. But super excited about that. We're just gonna keep going forward. That's what we do. So, and eventually we'll learn how to put a show on correctly, because that seems to be a difficult thing these days.
Brian, it's 8 o'clock my time, 7 o'clock your time. Any final words for the audience before we call it for the end of the show?
I think you should read all the books on witchcraft that were published before the 1980s. I think every would-be witch, whether or not you choose to follow that route, you should know about it, because you'll discover a lot when you start realizing that for a good 10 to 20 years, these books are all saying the same thing. And then all of a sudden new books come up that are saying something else. Then pretty soon, like, everyone goes crazy. You know, I think most people are getting their information off places like TikTok and, you know, things like that. And they're not really reading. I think reading is extremely important. Read a book. Maybe mine.
Exactly. So everybody, thank you so much. Thank you again, everybody, for your patience with my apparent echo. I apologize. Thanks for attending, and stay tuned for more Coven episodes and more interviews with the Warlock Press authors.
Yeah, so 2 more to go, and then we're bringing back Coven Dumb itself. All right, thanks, Sean. Hopefully we look good in this. What we sound like. All right, bye, everyone. If you have any questions, you can put them in there. This will be archived on YouTube and Facebook, so I can follow up with questions later. Thank you all for joining. Good night. I don't know how to turn this off. End call. No. Kaylin, come turn this off. Is it end?